So Kennedy was shot 4 times. There were 3 bullet holes in the pantry, and 5 bullets were removed, 1 each, from 5 different people who were shot. All right, so that sounds like a lot of bullets, but let's pretend that the LAPD's fantasy scenario is exactly correct and that they magically come down to 8 shots. All right, well, there's still a problem because there are 4 more bullet holes, 2 in the center divider, 2 in in the south side of the door frame, and so that's 4 more bullets. That's 12 bullets. And then if you were shooting towards Robert Kennedy as he came through the door and the bullet continued past the door, it would have been directly in line with the next bullet that was found, which was at the bottom of the stage door that Kennedy had walked out of. And the reason to be at the bottom is, one, if somebody was shooting from the table down, it makes that angle, but also the floor went up from there to the backstage door. There was a little bit of a ramp. And so that was like the 13th bullet found at the scene. And that one is actually in an AP photo. There's 2 cops pointing at, and the caption says the bullet is still in the wood. So we have FBI photos of those other door frame holes. And the LAPD knew about this, and LA County knew about this. In 1977, the county wrote the FBI and said, those pictures of bullet holes that you took in the pantry, they said, if you had said they were probable or possible bullet holes, we could ignore that. But since you called them unequivocally bullet holes, we would have to be looking for a second shooter. And to my knowledge, there's no official FBI response to that. I suspect because that puts the FBI in a pickle. It's like, well, we knew it was a conspiracy, but we didn't tell you. We didn't prosecute it. So they don't have a good answer to why. And they also don't want to say, we don't know what we're doing. Our official photographers don't know what bullet holes look like, even though that's all they do all day, every day. It's like they couldn't, there was no good answer for the FBI to that. And so predictably, there was no response to that letter. The shots, according to the autopsy, all came from behind while Sirhan was in front. They actually shot up pig's ears to figure the distance so that they would know with some certainty how far away the shooter must have been, because there were powder burns and soot right next to Kennedy's ear and on his clothes where he had been shot. And so they shot the ears and backed up, and they found between 1 inch to 1.5 inches was about exactly the right matching pattern. And so if the gun is 1 inch from the ear and Sirhan's gun muzzle is 3 feet in front, there's no way Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, which is why his own son, Robert Kennedy Jr., has pled for Sirhan to be paroled, because he too understands there's no way that evidence lines up. Sirhan could not have killed Robert Kennedy. Sirhan's bullets didn't hit anybody in the pantry, because not only were the police unable to match the Kennedy bullet to Sirhan's gun, they couldn't match any of the victim bullets to Sirhan's gun. And the 1975 panel couldn't match any of the victim bullets to Sirhan's gun. Now, they claim the reason for that, they said, is the barrel was heavily leaded. Now, supposedly, Sirhan had been firing copper-jacketed bullets, and copper-jacketed bullets clean out that lead, and it would have left a clean column there. And so then they postulated that, well, cops like to shoot up famous weapons and keep the bullets for souvenirs, and so everybody was firing the weapon, and that's why the bullets don't match. Well, that's actually not possible. In fact, if that were possible, for a fact that Dwayne Wolfer would have dummied up bullets using Sirhan's gun. I'm sure that would have been his first preference, right? No, the gun went to the grand jury, and from there right to the evidence, thing. And there's a reason for that, because the police are known to do things like that. So the gun is removed from the police immediately, and they never got that gun back. All right, so I believe the reason it was leaded was because Sirhan was firing leaded bullets at the range all day, and then fired blanks that weren't copper-jacketed, that didn't clean it out. And interestingly enough, there were shells in the gun. There were 8 shells in the gun when it was turned into evidence, because the police said the shells are still in the gun. Those shells were in the first court order for this 1975 panel. Those shells disappeared in the second court order, which was the one that went into effect. somebody knew that the shells might give away Sirhan was firing blanks and took them out of the court order. So the panel never got to see the shells. I find that really interesting and damning. One of the things that led to the creation of that panel was a mismatch between one of the victim bullets and the Kennedy bullet. All right, supposedly there were two cannelures on one bullet and one cannelure, little groove markings at the base of the bullet, different on a different bullet. And so they claimed they must have been shot from different guns. So that was one of the things the panel wanted to confirm, was that they all came from the same gun. Of course they came from the same gun. They were dummied up bullets. So they were all fired from the same gun. So, and again, we know that because the markings on the bullet that should have been the victim bullets didn't match the markings on the bullets that the panel investigated. In other words, that 1975 panel was a ridiculous waste of taxpayer money. They weren't even looking at actual victim or Kennedy bullets fired in the pantry on the night of June 5th. They weren't even looking at the real evidence. They didn't know that, but they weren't. So of course the bullets matched because they'd been fired from the same gun, but they didn't match Sirhan's gun. And that was the part the media left out, that they couldn't definitively match it to Sirhan's gun. And to me, that's the part that was the most important of all, because that exonerates Sirhan not only of killing Kennedy, but of wounding anyone. I called it the Wenke panel because that was the Judge Wenke who created the panel. That's kind of how we talk about it in the research community. He was convicted because, again, his defense team basically sold him down the river. And I've already shown his lead attorney, Grant Cooper, was compromised. The jury was fooled. And from the start, I mean, first of all, there was a big news story the day before the trial that Sirhan to plead guilty. And every juror saw that. And all but one of the jurors said that would not affect their conclusion. Well, of course it's going to affect their conclusion. If the guy's going to plead guilty, then obviously he did it, right? So the trial was a farce from the start. And one guy even said, well, if he's going to plead guilty, I assume that means he is guilty. And then the judge, is like, well, but if you were told that weren't the case, would you change your mind? He goes, well, yeah, maybe. And they still let him be on. Now, interestingly enough, that guy, his father died or was killed right before the end of the trial, and he had to step down and an alternative juror filled in for him. And pure speculation, but that would have been a certain mistrial. If somebody had found that guy had said what he said and was still allowed to be on the jury, that would have for sure given Sirhan a mistrial and a new trial. And so I couldn't help but wonder if somehow that juror was removed so there would be no mistrial, even though the whole thing was a mistrial. I mean, like I said, it was a show trial. They really put on the trial to show the public evidence that it wasn't a conspiracy. Everything that had been made public, they brought people onto the stand to try and shoot it down. So again, like the girl in the polka dot dress, that's where they brought Vince DiPiero, the witness from the pantry, who had clearly said the girl was wearing a white dress, dark polka dots, and dark hair. And then the police made him identify the girl as the blonde in the green dress with yellow lemons on it. And so I asked Vince, years later, I finally caught up with him. He was terrified to talk to me, by the way. Didn't know if I was going to kill him or not. I'm like, just a researcher. But for somebody who said ever since there was no conspiracy, he was terrified that somebody from the conspiracy was coming to get him. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I asked him why he identified that girl. And he's like, well, they basically told me if I said it was that girl, they would completely back me up on that. So it wasn't even a real identification. And he was young, and he, like I said, he was terrified as an adult. Imagine how much more scared he would have been immediately after the fact. Yeah. During the trial, it's funny, Juan Romero, the young busboy who was kneeling over Kennedy in the famous picture with the rosary, very sweet man. I met up with him in later years, and he did not identify Sirhan as the shooter at the trial. And I asked him, why didn't you? He's like, well, I couldn't be 100% sure. And I just felt it would be wrong to identify him if I wasn't 100% sure. He was one of the closest people to Sirhan. So if he wasn't sure Sirhan was the shooter, that's pretty interesting. And other witnesses were scared and afraid to talk. And I had trouble convincing several people to talk to me because the police had gone out to all the potential witnesses before the trial and said, you can't talk to anybody. And they didn't tell them until the trial is over. They made it sound like for life about this case. And so a lot of people to this day have been afraid to come forward. And, only in their aging adult years do they realize, hey, it's probably okay to talk about this now. So there may still be stories that come forward. Well, because they tackled a guy with a gun and assumed he was the gunman. I mean, think of it. You're in a crowd. Somebody pulls out a gun and starts shooting. Where does your eye go? Your eye, for the most part, your eye is going to go to the gun, except for that one woman who had mentally rehearsed, I'm going to look at Kennedy's head. But everybody else is looking at the gun. They're not looking at the gunman's face or whatever. They want to make sure they are not in the line of fire. George Plimpton and Rosie Greer jumped on Sirhan almost immediately, and they were wrestling with him. They were completely focused, and he's trying to get away. How could they not think he was guilty? I mean, what would give them any clue that he didn't do it? He's firing a gun. He's trying to get away. He's wrestling with them. He won't stop shooting, even though it's funny because they were like practically covering the gun with their hands, but none of them got shot because he was firing blanks. And it's like no one else got hurt that would have been in Sirhan's line of fire. In fact, they even pointed his gun away from the crowd. They physically moved his arm away from the crowd, and yet 5 other people were wounded. How is that possible? So they're not thinking of the bigger scenario. They're thinking of their immediate experience. We saw a guy fire a gun. We saw Kennedy fall down, and the guy tried to get away. Case closed, right? Again, facts can lie. That's a perfect example of it. The facts they had were telling them a lie. In fact, in the CIA's manual of trickery, which was written by a magician named John Mulholland, not related to the famous Mulholland of Mulholland Drive, but he talks about how if you just fool the eye, the mind will eventually work out the trick, and that a magician's real job is to fool the mind so that they don't know they've been tricked. And that's exactly what happened in the pantry. First of all, Sirhan never confessed during his trial, but that's a common misperception that all the media believe because during the trial, Sirhan was getting so frustrated with the testimony that was trying to paint him as mentally ill to explain why he had killed Robert Kennedy, because again, he didn't really have a good motive and were saying things like, I loved the man, so clearly he had to be mentally ill, and they hired some psychologists to come up with that. So in the course of that, they were bringing up his childhood and what had happened to him at 4 years old and stuff, and he tried to get rid of his lawyers. He tried to fire his lawyers, and the judge wouldn't let him. And Sirhan's like, okay, I killed Kennedy, with 20 years malice aforethought. It was an expression of frustration and sarcasm and ridicule, and it was made in the judge's chambers. When they went back out into the courtroom, Grant Cooper asked Sirhan to read that back from the transcript. This is his defense attorney who's getting him to put this statement on the record without. They didn't explain the context of why Sirhan said it. They just said, like, you've said some things in judges' chambers, and we want to read that back to the jury now. They didn't have to. It happened in chambers. It could have stayed secret, and it should have stayed secret. And then 2, to make Sirhan, say it himself in front of the jury. So all the reporters oh, he confessed to the crime during the trial. Well, he didn't really. And similarly, when he was up for parole, he was on a show with David Frost, did the interview with him, and Sirhan gave this I killed him because of this and this and this. I asked Munir about that, and Munir's like, Lisa, that whole show was entirely scripted, and they told Sirhan, you have to say exactly these words or you will not get paroled. So, and again, Sirhan's not... He's trusting. He trusts if a lawyer is hired to represent him, he does what the lawyer tells him. And so, and again, having no knowledge to the contrary, because at that point there weren't any books that he had access to that showed he was a mind-controlled patsy, he said what they told him to say. And, they gave him a motive. And he even said that at one point. He's like, I'd rather die and say I did it for my country than say I did it because I was crazy. It's like, if I'm going to die anyway, I might as well make it for a good reason. And so he gave a very reasoned confession. But again, it was scripted. It wasn't based on reality. And sadly, again, because it reinforces the official story, that's the thing that gets played all the time. None of this evidence that I've been sharing I've ever seen on TV. When you're in a hypnotic state, memory loss is very common, and it can also be encouraged. The hypnotist can actually program you to forget. And the CI was experimenting with not just hypnosis, but also drugs and hypnosis in combination, because they found in that case, it was almost entirely impossible to ever recover a true memory of what had happened. And there's some indications that Sirhan may possibly have been drugged that night, because again, not drunk, but a little out of it, which might have been the hypnosis, might also have been drugs. Scopolamine is an incredibly powerful hypnotic drug, which would add to the suggestibility. And it can be made into like candy form. And somebody described a drink where they said there was a little red candy floating in it that Sirhan was drinking. Could have been a maraschino cherry, On the other hand, it was like a half a maraschino cherry, which is a little weird because they usually come in whole pieces, not halves, but who knows? But what if it was a candy? What if it was scopolamine? The CI was literally experimenting with exactly that stuff in that time period. So it's not impossible that drugs and hypnosis have made it so hard for him to remember. And to this day, he does not remember, and he's tired of trying. He spent 50 years in jail, with a lot of time on his hands trying to remember what happened. He literally can't remember. And the police realized that he was telling the truth when he said he couldn't remember for the first 4 hours after he was arrested. So interesting. I'm reading the transcript, and they're asking him simple questions like, what kind of car do you drive? And he's like, well, I don't remember. And they think he's lying, and they're like, well, what about this car? What about this car? He's like, really don't remember. But then they'll ask him something that he knows, and he will be very forthcoming about it. When they ask him his name, he changes the subject. So either he doesn't remember who he is and doesn't want to admit that, or he's been programmed to avoid that particular question. And at one point, they got a report from somewhere that he was married, and this was his name, and such, and they say, so you're married? He's like, am I? He's like, I don't remember. I'm like, how can you not remember being married? But the police believed that he was being sincere. And they said that when the next guy comes into the room, they're like, if he says he doesn't remember, he really doesn't remember. And the DA knew something was off. And at one point he stops right like mid-sentence. He's like, do you know where you are? Do you know what you've been charged with? And Sirhan's like, not really, And he's like, you've been charged with a crime. You're going to be before a judge and this and that. Do you understand what I'm saying? And Sirhan's like, well, as long as you say it. He is so out of it. And they can't figure out why. And yet he starts talking about the philosophy of justice. And he starts talking about the Boston Strangler case. And he starts talking about these other things on a very intellectual level, and he's joking with them, and he makes fun of somebody's fat gut, and, but he can't say anything about himself, who he is, what kind of car he had, whether he's married. Very interesting. And again, all of that, signs of hypnosis. And one of the signs of hypnosis you can't fake are dilated pupils. And there is a report that, when he was put in the car and taken from the hotel, they, shone the light in his eye and the pupils didn't contract. And that is one of the sure signs of hypnosis that you can't fake. I think it wasn't until I went back and retraced the evidence on the bullets. I had talked to this woman, Lynn Mangan, who was a researcher for Sirhan. She'd been a neighbor, and she had looked into the ballistic evidence. And she's not a very clear person or a very good writer, very wonderful woman and very smart, but not, when I would talk to her, I would get more confused than enlightened sometimes. But she was the first one that told me, look, they switched the bullets. Here's what the marking should have said, and here's what it did say. And I didn't believe her. I was like, literally like, they wouldn't do that. That's cheating. I mean, the police just wouldn't do that. Well, I found out years later from a coworker at my office job that I've been at for many years. He was volunteering, which I didn't even know you could do, but he was volunteering with the public defender's office. And he said, oh yeah, they give us a handbook on how the police fudge the evidence and, make up bullets. And I'm like, they give you a handbook? That goes, yeah, it's pretty common. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, can I get a copy of that handbook? He's like, oh, I'm pretty sure they won't let me give that out. So, but this is not new. And that's the other reason I wrote this book. As I got into that, I'm like, if the police can just make people guilty and just make evidence up out of the air, how many other cases does that affect? And I really believe that's one of the reasons this case may never get justice, because if Sirhan is freed on this, other cases will have to be reinvestigated. And it could cost the state billions in reparations for all these people jailed unfairly. I mean, there's so many lawsuits out there waiting to happen. It's easier for the police and the DA's office to just close ranks and continue to lie. It's easier, it's cheaper, and I'm sure in their minds they can justify it as, but we're saving taxpayers billions of dollars, and these probably weren't good people anyway. They're probably guilty of something. And Sirhan being a Palestinian, especially in the culture of today, a lot of people don't care. They don't seem to care that millions of people are being displaced right now. Why would they care about one Palestinian jailed for a crime he didn't commit? And that breaks my heart. People have tried to blame the mob for this. In fact, I think when my book came out, I upset some documentaries that were going to go down that route. And I'm sorry, the mob doesn't control the media. The mob doesn't control lawyers. All right, but the CIA is capable of all of this. And the mob doesn't control police departments, but the LAPD and the CIA have actually had a long time collaboration. In fact, Robert Mayhew had been involved with the LAPD in making a porno flick showing the Indonesian leader Sukarno supposedly being seduced by a blonde Soviet agent. And this was to be released in Indonesia to show that Sukarno was compromised. And it's just incredible the things that happen. And as I said, the LAPD turned to the CIA for information about Sirhan and his background in Palestine, they said, when they were doing this investigation. But the CIA also, like I said, got kind of called, and suddenly Curry is no longer a suspect. There's weird intersections. People are following the Sirhan family, maybe the CIA, maybe the FBI, maybe both. The CIA has so much more power in this country than people understand. We talk about Epstein and his ability to, sexual blackmail on politicians and stuff. Well, it isn't talked about enough, in my opinion. But that's how the CIA got its start, was sexually blackmailing Hoover. You can't believe that it stopped at Hoover. In fact, Angleton said he had bugs all over DC, and said in one of his depositions, like, well, any intelligence agency that doesn't know what's being said about it around town isn't worth its own salt. So one of the reasons they have immense power is they blackmail anybody who seems to be a threat to them. And so it's and often a death threat will do. I had death threats. It didn't deter me. And I know some of Sirhan's attorneys over the years have received death threats, but that's usually step one, is the death threat. They want to scare you off. And if that doesn't work, then, depending on how successful and powerful you are, other measures can be taken and people can be set up. They tried to set Ted Kennedy up on a sex scandal at one point, the CIA. And John Meyer, who I mentioned earlier is sharing an office with Robert Mayhew, he got wind of the plot and he was able to alert Ted Kennedy so that nothing happened. All right, but this kind of stuff goes on. When I worked on the Jerry Brown campaign, The campaign manager would always go into his hotel room first because often there would be some young nubile woman, sometimes naked, on his bed there, and she would shoo them out. They were planted there in the hopes of compromising him. It's sadly, this is the world we live in. Politics is a very high stakes game. They did have a mind control program called MK Ultra. They also had a mind control program called Artichoke, and one that they did jointly with the Navy called Bluebird, and something called QK Hilltop. There were a number of mind control programs over the years, some in connection with other agencies, some not. In some of their earliest experiments, they used primarily prisoners and drug addicts because they were deniable. Who would believe what a prisoner said? Who would care what a prisoner, complained about? They're already in prison, right? And same with drug addicts. Who cares? Scum of the earth. It's just shocking the way they would do that. Some people in later years who were victims of these programs have successfully sued the CIA and won large settlements over this. These cases are not widely reported in the media, nor again have the mind control programs been given much coverage in the media. In fact, there was that film Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson years ago that actually looked like it was written by somebody who knew quite a bit about those programs because there were a lot of actually legitimate pieces in that film as to how things are done. And Catcher in the Rye was a book that showed up in the case of Mark David Chapman, who supposedly shot Lennon, although there's a new book coming out. It's winging its way to me as we speak, where the author did a lot of research, and it looks like similar to Sirhan, he couldn't have done it. He too may have been a mind-controlled patsy. And John Hinckley, who shot Reagan but didn't kill him, that guy seems to be a mind-controlled patsy too. There are these kind of cookie-cutter templates that can be repeated over time until they are exposed. And so again, part of the reason I've spent all this time on that and that I'm still talking about is I believe by exposing these templates, we take away some weapons and make it harder for good people to be killed in the future. All the people killed in the 60s were promoting peace and justice and fairness and cooperation with other nations rather than domination of other nations. I was originally going to write a book about the John Kennedy assassination and Robert Kennedy, and I was going to call it Collision Course because I felt that the trajectory the Kennedys were on and the trajectory that the CIA and the establishment were on had to collide at some point, and only one of them was going to survive because it had to do with how does the U.S. treat other nations around the world? Do we partner with them and try and build them up, or do we crush them and make them subservient to our business interests and keep sure we have a low-cost labor base outside the country? And sadly, we know which faction won. I absolutely do. And here's one of the reasons why. I remember reading an interview from E. Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate burglars, who talked about how the CIA is very careful about choosing the date of an operation and making sure that they have some psychological significance to that date to kind of embed in the memory, what happened. And so it's very interesting to me that Robert Kennedy was killed 2 years to the day exactly after he gave my favorite speech of all time, his Day of Affirmation speech in South Africa, and 1 year to the date from the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. So the head of the CIA's counterintelligence, James Angleton, who many believe was probably involved in the JFK assassination, close friend of Alan Dulles, who ran the CIA for years, kind of the godfather of the CIA, who was then fired by John Kennedy, and then shows up on the Warren Commission. And worse, Alan Dulles actually showed up at Langley's training facility called The Farm in Virginia the weekend of the assassination, from the 22nd to the 24th. His desk calendar shows him at The Farm. Now, Alan Dulles was not a farmer. The farm to him is only one thing. It's Camp Peary. And so Angleton was so close with Ellen Dulles that he literally carried his ashes at his funeral. So these two were close collaborators. They both hated both Kennedys with a purple passion, as did Bill Harvey and several other higher ups in the CIA. Uh, Angleton was also the liaison with the Mossad and a huge proponent of Israel. And which is funny because Angleton and Dulles were also both involved in bringing Nazis to America. But somewhere along the way, their alliance shifted to the Israelis. And in fact, one of the novels I read suggested that Angleton had actually tipped Israel off before the Arab-Israeli War, that the attack was coming, so they were super prepared. It's called the Six-Day War because it was over in 6 days. And I would not put that past Angleton at all, because his loyalty was to himself first, to Dulles second, to Israel third, and to the US fourth. I mean, very clearly in the records. Angleton also ended up with copies of the Robert Kennedy autopsy photos. How he got those, I have no idea. Who he got those from, I have no idea. They've never been made public. The family requested they not be made public, which I can understand. The Kennedy family, this was so traumatic for them. I mean, they'd already just lost their uncle 5 years earlier, and then the father to 11 children, 10 that were born and Rory on the way. They needed a father. That family desperately needed a father, and they had no one. And so, when people say, oh, they all became sex addicts or drug addicts, it's like, who can blame them? I have nothing but sympathy for the members of that family because of what happened to them. On the other hand, I do wish at some point they would read my book and learn what really happened to their father. And I know it's just too traumatizing for them to reopen that and relive that night and go through that. So those autopsy photos have never been made public. So how did Angleton get them? And again, Angleton's relationship with the CIA, Angleton was also deeply involved with the mind control programs. And I asked John Meyer if through his son at that point, if there was any connection between Mayhew and Angleton. And he goes, oh, yeah, they used to speak on the phone all the time. And I'm like, really? That's hugely significant if true. And, I'd love to see a paper trail on that, but these guys are really good about not leaving a paper trail. So at this point, I consider that a serious and interesting allegation. I don't know if it's true, but it would make a lot of sense. And if Mayhew was running, as I believe he was, the Robert Kennedy assassination, it made sense that he would go to Angleton and say, who can I use for Patsy? He's like, oh, let's get a Palestinian. That's a slam dunk. And there was, Sirhan had been through an accident at a horse racing track where he had, an injury that put him in the hospital. The horse racing track was right next to a naval facility far inland in Corona. All right, it's the Naval Surface Weapons Division. And they had a hospital where the CIA had evidently done some mind control experiments. So it's so interesting that Sirhan would end up there at this facility. I don't know for sure if he went to that facility, but that was the main hospital in the area where he was injured. So it seems likely that that's where he went. I don't know that for a fact. I believe that might be where he went. And, I read in one of the books on hypnosis, they said we often would spot the hypnotizable people in the hospital because, when they're under drugs or coming out of anesthesia or whatever, it'd be really easy to try a couple of suggestions and see how suggestible they are. And somebody must have figured out that Sirhan was very suggestible because after that accident, and the doctor that was interviewed said, it was just some surface wounds. He fell off a horse and was kicked by the horse, and he had some cuts, that needed to be stitched up and stuff, but no permanent damage, no internal damage. And yet he went to the doctor like 13 times in the next 12 months. I mean, I had a broken arm and I haven't gone to the doctor 13 times in 12 months. I had ankle surgery and I didn't go to the doctor 13 times. So I don't buy that. I think somebody picked him up to be a mind control. They had mind controlled couriers who would send messages to foreign countries. In that same notebook, there's a lot of writing in Arabic and talk about Aqaba and, other places in the Middle East where Sirhan had never been, but maybe was going to be sent. There's a page that says, "Long live Nasser, long live Nasser, long live Nasser." And maybe he was being prepped for a Nasser assassination plot because Kennedy wasn't even running for president at the time Sirhan was being programmed. If it started as we all think it did after the horse fall, because his family said his personality changed. He became much more withdrawn. He was much more easily triggered, couldn't stand needles. He was very kind of paranoid that the LAPD were bugging him when he was being interviewed. It's like, who thinks like that in 1968? That wasn't in the everyday lexicon, right? I can't think of many TV shows that talked about, bugging or wiretapping it in 1968. So anyway, it seems like if the CI got their hooks in him, it was probably then, and I'm sure it had nothing to do with the Kennedys initially, because a lot of people thought Kennedy wasn't going to run until 1972. He didn't even throw his hat in the ring until after the Iowa and the New Hampshire primaries. Now, today, we can't even imagine that because the election's over after like the Iowa and the New Hampshire primaries. If you don't win one of those first two, or at least one of the first three, which is why they wanted to move South Carolina up because Biden lost Iowa and New Hampshire and didn't win until South Carolina. So they want to switch the order now in the party. But in those days, the convention wasn't, I mean, the convention picked the candidates, the states and the primaries were just for show. And now I think we're more cognizant that that's still the case, that, our votes in the primaries don't always count the way we think they should. And the convention still picks the candidates. A court ruling showed that the Democratic Party and all political parties are essentially private corporations and get to choose their own candidates. But there was a really good chance that Robert Kennedy would have been the candidate, but he didn't enter until March. And then when he entered, LBJ dropped out, which is also interesting. People have tried to blame LBJ for being behind the assassination of JFK. I'm like, if he had the balls to kill JFK, no way would he stop at a chance to run for president again. So I've never bought that. No. Whenever I talk about the defense team, I do always use the air quotes because he had no defense until very recently, when finally a few good attorneys have taken an interest in his case. But for decades, no, he was not given a fair trial. Again, the trial was a show trial designed entirely to show evidence of conspiracy that had been made public in the media and to shoot it down where they could. And then of course just not to talk about other things, but also to give the semblance of the trial that Lee Harvey Oswald never had, because he was killed before he went to trial, and people felt that justice wasn't served. After Sirhan appeared in court and appeared to get representation, and of course the trial was not televised, it was just reported in the media afterwards, and very selectively, because a lot of interesting things happened at the trial. In fact, while I was going through the trial transcript, I knew that they had talked about hypnosis, and I'm like, well, when am I going to get to the point where they talk about hypnosis? And I would come to these missing pages, and if, one missing page I wasn't going to worry about, but then two or three, then a set of like five, and then three more. And I'm like, okay, I want to know what's in these missing pages and why those pages are missing. So I called the California State Archives and I said, look, pages this, and this are missing. Can you get them for me? And the woman looked and she's like, wow, they're missing in our copy too. She goes, but let me check around. And so then she called the California Supreme Court, which did have an intact copy of the entire trial transcript. So I had them send me the missing pages, and surprise, surprise, as I had already started to suspect, those were the pages that talked about hypnosis during the trial. And so interesting that they were selectively removed. Another thing that was removed was the suggestion by Sirhan's own attorneys that if for any reason he was to be freed by the jury, he should go to the mental facility at Vacaville. Well, unknown to the public at that point in time, Vacaville was another one of the CIA's mind control experimental places where they were conducting some of the MK Ultra experiments. All right, so it's like the CIA wasn't going to let Sirhan go no matter what. Even if he was freed, they were going to make sure he went to one of their controlled mental institutions. I mean, how sad is that? It's like this guy was in it up to his eyeballs and couldn't get out no matter what he tried. And again, how interesting is it that somebody wants to corrupt the physical record of the trial to keep people from learning about hypnosis and the fact that there was really good evidence that Sirhan had been hypnotized, and removing that from the record so it would just sound like a crazy conspiracy theory if some journalists went later and didn't bother to follow up on the missing pages. No, and that is a super interesting question. And in fact, this was something Sirhan didn't even know until I sent him my book in prison. And when he got to that point, he called his brother. He's like, "Oh my gosh, the gun at the trial wasn't even the gun that I had." Because there were three gun numbers that showed up in this case. The first gun number was H53725. That was a gun that was turned into evidence, taken from Sirhan, sent, Rayford Johnson took it with him to the hospital and then turned it into the police, and they read the gun number, and that's what it said. But the gun number at the trial was a slightly different gun number. It was like H58735 instead of 53735. And we know this because it's in the trial transcript. The numbers 3 and 8 are not near each other on the keyboard. Even on a shorthand keyboard, you don't mix up those two. And the lawyers went through every detail of that transcript every morning before the trial, and this is in the trial transcript record. They make numerous corrections. Oh, this guy's name is spelled this way. Oh, that's the wrong evidence number. Oh, this, oh, that. They didn't make any correction on the gun number. I believe that was the gun that Wolfer used to dummy up the bullets. And I believe he did that so that when he came to the trial, he could say in complete honesty, those bullets came from this gun and no other, because the bullets turned into evidence were shot from the gun that never belonged to Sirhan. That's what I believed. And I think that's why it ended up there. And in his own testimony, Wolfer talks about how because Sirhan's gun was unavailable, they were able to find a gun with a very close serial number. All right. Now there is another gun number in the case, and it's something like H186 something. It's like way different. Doesn't sound the same, doesn't end with 725, but H53725 and H58725, those are really similar numbers, right? And the reason you'd want a similar gun is that guns, come off an assembly line. If you can get a gun that was made very close to it, it will have similar rifling characteristics in the gun barrel. When a bullet goes through the barrel, it picks up any flaws or imperfections, and all metal has flaws or imperfections inside a gun barrel, and they leave these little striation marks on a bullet as it goes through, and that's how the police do bullet comparisons. If the marks line up exactly, they know it came from the same gun. And so that's why the 1975 Winky panel could line up the bullets and say they came from the same gun, but it's also why they couldn't match them to the Sirhan gun, because they couldn't line up the test bullet rifling characteristics with the fake victim bullet characteristics. And so that's how, they knew they couldn't claim any match to the Sirhan gun. So anyway, during the trial, Wolfer had made it clear that he got a hold of this second gun with a very close serial number. So I think what happened is that that's the gun that they used at the trial. And I would bet you that somewhere along the way, they were planning to make that into the Sirhan gun and then weren't able to. Like they were hoping to switch it out and put that one in evidence. And maybe they realized that the earlier records already had the 53725, so they couldn't change it. I don't know what really happened, but definitely a different gun at the trial than was even used in the crime. And that alone should be cause for a reopening of the case and a mistrial. I mean, you can't convict somebody with the wrong weapon. That's not legal. And in the records and on the evidence envelope, there's, again, a third gun number. That was the gun that was the second gun in a documentary that Ted Chirac made back in the early 70s, because he found that second gun number, and it looked like some of the test bullets and maybe the dummy bullets had been fired from that gun. Wolfer used a gun for sound tests to prove that Sandy Serrano, who, when she sat on the back steps just before the girl ran out yelling, "We shot him," she also claimed she heard 6 backfires. And she only ever called them backfires, but the police thought, oh, she's claiming she heard gunshots. She never claimed that. She claimed she heard backfires, but that they came running out shortly after these backfires. So they did sound tests with one of those guns, I don't know which gun, to prove that she couldn't have heard that, proving a negative, setting up a straw man and shooting it down to discredit her, right? So anyway, there's really 3 guns in the case, only one of which, belonged to Sirhan. I found the missing pages as I was reading. I would find gaps, and I really suspected they would contain hypnosis, and they did. I got a copy of them by calling the California State Archives, and their copy was the same as mine. It was still missing the pages, but the archivist there said, "Let me check around." And she called around and she found an intact copy at the California Supreme Court, copied the missing pages for me and sent it back. And I told her, "I hope you saved some for your copy." There should be more than one intact copy out there somewhere. And sure enough, they contained references to hypnosis and also to Vacaville, where the CIA had been doing MKUltra experiments and where Sirhan's defense team wanted him to go if by any reason he was freed in the course of the trial. If they found him for any reason not guilty, they still wanted him to go to a medical facility. So Dr. Dan Brown is one of the foremost hypnosis experts, or was, I understand he recently died, was one of the foremost experts in hypnosis in the country. He's written several textbooks on it, testified at trials, credentialed expert. Dr. William Pepper, when he was Sirhan's lawyer for a time, arranged for Dr. Brown to come and interview Sirhan at the prison and hypnotize him with permission from the state. And so Dr. Brown got to spend 60 hours with Sirhan, which is unusual, not all at once, but over a period of a couple of years. And in that time, he asked him a bunch of open-ended questions to try and figure out what Sirhan did and didn't remember. And I have to talk about a different incident here because it's directly relevant to what happened. And I had a personal experience with hypnosis. I wasn't hypnotized, but I sat down next to a woman before a hypnosis show who was not yet hypnotized and then became part of the show and was hypnotized. So I got to see a before and after. And, before, she's perfectly normal, nothing wrong with her, not crazy, just as normal as could be and very intelligent. And we had a nice little chat. And then during the show, she volunteered, went up on stage, got hypnotized, and the hypnotist handed her like play money, like a Monopoly bill or something. And he told her it was a $35,000 check. And she's like, "Oh, I won. And, just what you'd expect to see. And then at the end of the show, he's like, "Okay, you're all unhypnotized and, go home." And I didn't see her right away after the show because I ran after the hypnotist to ask him about Sirhan. And that made him visibly so nervous, he literally left the area. Now, he was way too young to have been directly involved, but I think every hypnosis says during their show, you can't be programmed to do something against your will. And that's true, but misleading, because you can be hypnotized to do something without your knowledge. All right. If somebody changes your reality for you enough, you could maybe be made to do something you wouldn't normally do. For example, let's say I wanted you to kill your mother. All right. I wouldn't hypnotize you and say, "Go kill your mother." You wouldn't do it, even under hypnosis. Maybe even if you were the most highly hypnotizable, you still might not do it. But if I said instead, "This Soviet agent is going to come into your room. She looks exactly like your mother. She's even had plastic surgery to look like her. And they've taught her every mannerism of your mother. She's going to cry and plead and beg with you exactly like your mother. But she's actually holding your real mother hostage. And if you don't kill that woman, you will never see your mother again." Now, in that scenario, under hypnosis, there are people who would kill their mother believing they were saving their mother. You see how that works? So it's like, yeah, you can't be programmed to do something against your will, but your reality can be changed. So for this woman, she only had a small reality change, And I did see her again. So after the hypnotist left the area, the crowd parted and the woman was still there looking very agitated. So I went up to her, thought maybe she'd lost her family. I'm like, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? And she goes, well, I have to give this back. And I laughed. I'm like, well, it's just play money. I don't think he cares. She goes, no, it's a $35,000 check. I can't keep this. I have to give this back. I'm like, oh my God, she's still in hypnosis. And you would not know. She wasn't sleepy eyed or droopy. I mean, we all have these images, what we think a person under hypnosis looks like. She looked normal, but she was saying something crazy. And so I'm like, okay, can I touch that with you? Can we look at it together? What do you see in the upper right there? And it's pointing to where the 100 in a circle was. And she's like, no, it's a $35,000 check. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this woman is in the grip of a hypnotic illusion. She's seen something that isn't there, and nothing I say or do is going to change her reality. She's just going to have to come out of this on her own. And that is what I believed happened to Sirhan, that he was in the grip of a hypnotic reality in the pantry that was not what everybody else was seeing. But I didn't know what that reality was until I read Dan Brown's interview with Sirhan, right? Because as part of the court filing, they had excerpts from these interviews. And so he's asking Sirhan questions. What do you see? What do you hear? And through that, we found the gap in Sirhan's memory was filled with this. He remembered a girl in a polka dot dress, and he poured coffee for her, and she wanted cream and sugar. And the two of them asked the third man with a tall, round face, who I later found out was wearing a polka dot tie. And he sent them into the pantry, and she went in, and Sirhan followed her, and he thought he was going to get lucky because he thought she seemed really sexy, and she was giving him attention, and he wasn't used to that because he's kind of a small guy, and here's this big, beautiful, buxom girl. Everybody talked about what a good figure she had, and her curved up nose, and her big breasts, and her bubble butt, as somebody called it. So anyway, he's following her around like a puppy dog. At one point, she puts him on this ice tray stand, or a tray stacker by the ice machine. And from there, she puts him in front of her, and she's holding on to him. And that's where Vince DiPiero sees the two of them. And he said they both had this same sickly smile, and it looked like he was sick to his stomach, and it looked like she was holding him there. So he saw them, and he noticed how pretty the girl was, and he was watching the girl. So, we're getting Sirhan's memory under hypnosis exactly lines up with what Vince DiPiero remembers. And then Sirhan remembers the girl looking up and to the right. Well, up and to the right, it would be where a shooter on the table would be standing. So also, if somebody's standing on the table, they would have the best view over the crowd for when Robert Kennedy entered the room. So it's clear to me that she was looking up to get the signal that Kennedy is coming. At some point, she must have gotten that signal because now she moves Sirhan to the middle of the room, and then Sirhan remembers her pinching him a certain way. And then he doesn't remember anything except being back at a shooting range. And all he saw were shooting targets in front of him. And he pulled out his gun and started firing at the targets. And that's Sirhan's memory. And while he's firing at the targets, suddenly he has the sensation of being choked. He was literally being choked because people thought he was shooting at Robert Kennedy and were trying to get him to stop. And one guy literally put his arm around his neck and started choking him. And that almost, but not quite, brought him out of hypnosis. All right. And then, of course, he doesn't really remember much until he's in jail the next morning. And every time his defense team hypnotized him, as he was coming out of hypnosis, he would shiver a bit, like he'd get a chill. And the prison guards noticed that Sirhan got a chill like right before morning. And he had asked at one point, have I been before the magistrate yet? It was almost as if that was what was going to bring him out of hypnosis. And it wasn't until he had been arraigned, that's when he had the chill and seemed to come out of hypnosis. So I thought that's also interesting. And again, it's plausible to me because I literally met somebody in the grip of a hypnotic illusion. And when Sirhan is not under hypnosis, he's never told that story, and he doesn't remember ever being hypnotized. He used to question his defense team when they would hypnotize him because he's like, I don't believe you. I was never hypnotized. And so one time they did this is a common trick. They literally stuck a pin in his hand under hypnosis. And then when they woke him out, the pin was still there. And he's like, oh my God, there's a pin in my hand. How did that get there? And that's how they proved to him that they had hypnotized him. Well, he's only been granted parole once, although there was one time earlier where it seemed like he was very close to being granted parole, and that was sabotaged. And I don't want to go into that whole story, but um, he's been up for parole, I want to say 18 or 19 times. I've lost track. It's been a lot of times. So it was really a big deal a few years ago when he was granted parole. And that was the appearance where Robert Kennedy Jr. and his brother Douglas both pled before the commission to release him. I'd also said the parole board my book. I would like to think that had some effect, but who knows, if they read it. But we also, me and some friends of mine asked people to write letters to the parole board on Sirhan's behalf, and they got over 100 letters of support. And pretty much the only letter opposing was from the rest of the Robert Kennedy family, who didn't want him released because they don't know he's innocent and still believe he's guilty and have a very emotional attachment to that, unfortunately. And so he was granted parole, but then the governor, Gavin Newsom, vetoed the parole. And he is now literally the only governor in the country that still has veto power over the parole board. That's been done away with in every other state. So it's really unfair. It's his own parole board. He appoints them. It's kind of a vote of no confidence on his own people to do something like that. And he also had signaled he planned to veto before the parole, was like even dry. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to seriously consider all the facts of the case. And then he wrote this long, rambling memo about why he did. And he claimed, I went to the archives and I examined the evidence myself. I'm like, well, you didn't do a very good job, or you would have noticed the bullets in the police log and the markings didn't match the bullets in evidence. I mean, you can't look into this case for 2 weeks and claim to have looked into it thoroughly when it took me 10 years to figure out what I know, right? It's like that has no credibility with me. But the press, again, dutifully reported that. And, oh, Governor Newsom looked into the case and decided Sirhan should not be paroled. And therefore he was denied. And that his denial is still under appeal. There's one more appeal. They lost their first appeal. The current legal team around Sirhan has one more chance to prove that he does deserve to be paroled in this sequence, and then he will be up for parole again. So frankly, I'm hoping Gavin Newsom does run for president, as everybody expects he eventually will. And so that he's gone, so that maybe a governor who won't overturn a legitimate parole decision and Sirhan can finally go free. Bobby, I call him Bobby. I met him. I actually met him through David Talbot, and I've been to his house. And the day that Thane Eugene Caesar died, he's like, Lisa, get over here and bring any book you have that has a picture of Thane Eugene Caesar. So I did. I threw about 6 books in a bag and I ran over to his house. He's not, too far from where I live. And he was absolutely convinced that Thane Caesar had killed his father. And I believed for years that that was the case too, until I found witnesses who said a guy in a white busboy uniform appeared to have shot Kennedy at point blank range right in the head. And that actually made sense because Thane Caesar's this big guy. He's like 6'2", big and burly, taller than Robert Kennedy, who was about 5'9". And he could hide a gun with his big burly body and shoot him under the arm, and no one would have even known it was happening. But if he put his arm up and over Kennedy's shoulder to hit him in the back of the head, he would have been pretty exposed, and it would have been hard for it to hide that. So it makes more sense that he's holding him in place and shooting him, but holding him, which one witness described, they saw the guard holding Kennedy as Kennedy's trying to break free. In fact, there's a picture of Kennedy with Thane Caesar's clip-on tie right at his outstretched hand in the picture. It's like the tie is just beyond his hand. And based on that photo, a lot of us had thought that Thane Caesar killed Robert Kennedy, and maybe he did. I mean, it's still possible that he did. I just found the other two witnesses incredibly compelling. So I told Bobby, it's like, well, don't say that he killed him. It's like, he definitely shot him, but I'm not 100% sure he killed him. He's like, but Lisa, he's like, you know a lot more than I do. He's like, I'm not with you there. I don't know yet. I haven't read that much yet. And he's like, all I can say is what I know at this point based on what I believe. And I'm like, but you have an expert here who's researched it like 20 more years than you have, who's telling you that didn't happen. And but he wanted to say that, so that's what he said. And that's the night he posted his Instagram post saying he believed Thane Caesar had killed his father. So yeah, I had met him as he was working on his book, American Values, and had been over to his house and helped him. And we kind of bonded when I said, look, by the way, I know your father never tried to kill Castro. He's like, I've always believed that. And I went and talked to Castro, and Castro didn't think he was trying to do it either. And I actually showed him the CIA document. It's the IG report, the Inspector General report on the Castro assassination plots. And right at the end of the report, they basically say, can we claim we had executive authority to kill, for these plots? And they answer their own question, not in this case. And they said, well, we only told the Kennedys about the plots that had ended, and we didn't tell them about the plots that were continuing, even though Bobby had said, you absolutely have to check with me. You cannot just go off and do this on your own. And they just didn't. They just flat out disobeyed him. And that's in their own files, and it's in there a couple of times. And because they go through like a news article where it makes that accusation, and to the left of it, they're like, nope, not true. So the CIA knows that the Kennedys didn't try and kill them, and yet it's a CIA asset named Sam Halpern who has talked to every author. Wherever you see that in a book, the source is always Sam Halpern, who was one of the deputies under Richard Helms, head of the CIA, worked for some higher ups, also was a New York Times reporter, because again, there's that, media and CIA nexus there. And people believe this liar, Sam Halpern, but they don't believe the CIA's own private document that was so closely held. There were only 3 copies of it ever made. It was a miracle we finally got it released. All right. So anyway, so that's kind of how I bonded with, excuse me. So that's how I bonded with Robert Kennedy. Of course, I had to break with him later when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict erupted again in the fall of this year, and his unequivocal support for Israel was more than I could handle. Because that's all they know. Their knowledge stopped about probably when the trial ended. And that was the end of their curiosity. And Bobby has tried to instill a little bit more curiosity. And what about this and what about that? But he doesn't know the facts well enough himself to really open their eyes. And so it's a shame. It's like the less blind leading the very blind. And so he hasn't been able to persuade them. And, he would call me like one night, he's like, Lisa, do you have the Jules Wickover book? And I was like, yeah, I do. Because that was one of the guys who was in the pantry when the shooting went down. He's like, well, what does the book say? And I'm like, well, Bobby, first of all, the book was published in 1968. All right. Meaning none of the files were released. So it's like, of course, it only has the official story in it. That's all that was known at that time. And so that's kind of what his family went by, because there was somebody they knew and trusted. And it wasn't based, there were no statements of conspiracy, no witnesses, because no one knew that yet. If you weren't up at 2 a.m. when Sandy Serrano was on LATV, you missed it. Didn't make a big news story that, a girl in a polka dot dress had run away saying, we shot him, we shot him. The media shut that story down. So, I can't blame them for their ignorance, their fear, their resistance. And yet at the same time, if it were my father, I would hope I would have the moral courage to look deeper into it. Well, I was super nervous, I have to say. When my book came out, it's like, oh my gosh, what if there's some huge piece of evidence that I missed that's going to prove Sirhan really was firing bullets, and I just never found it. And I'm really happy to report that that never happened. That in all the years since, and a lot of the research community doesn't want to go there because it's hard for them. They haven't seen the files like I have. Most of them haven't dug that deep in. A lot of them get caught up in the girl in the polka dot dress and don't really look into the ballistics. They don't feel comfortable looking into that. They don't know anything of, well, I ask, I research, I talk to gun experts and owners, and I ask the LAPD about things. I mean, literally, I've gone up to cops on the street and said, by the way, if something's turned into evidence, for example, one of the Sirhan or one of the victim bullets wasn't turned in until like 48 hours later. And it was turned in after that 5 hour period where I believe Wolfer dummied up the bullets. And so I suspected that the reason that bullet wasn't turned into evidence and much later is that he got the call from Wolfer saying, don't turn in that bullet. We're going to have to dummy something up. Yeah, and so I asked a cop on the street one time. It's like, hey, by the way, I'm a screenwriter, which is true. When you turn bullets into evidence, is there ever a delay? Is there ever a reason like it wouldn't be logged for 24 hours? Like you turn it in one day, but it's not logged till the next day. And they're like, no, that never happens. You wait, you stand there until the bullet is logged in, and then you get your receipt and you go about your way. So, that's how I did the research. If I don't know something, I asked somebody who obviously would know. I just didn't tell them the context of my question and got a lot of good information that way. Sirhan is surviving. He's got some physical ailments that he's, being treated for. He was so hopeful of getting paroled when all that support was behind him. And then when the governor vetoed it, definitely took the wind out of his sails a bit. And what's really sad is that night, everyone in his cell block, they were all pulling for him and they were all so happy for him. And when the veto came down, it was Sirhan going around calming all the other prisoners, saying, it's not that bad. I'm okay. Thank you for feeling bad, but please don't be upset. I mean, he's a born peacemaker. His goal when he was a kid, he wanted to be a UN diplomat. And that version of Sirhan was taken from us by the CIA through the mind control and the setup, and we will never see the diplomat he could have been. And I believe he would have been a really good one. He's a genuinely kind and nice person. And all the people who knew him well said that about him. Very polite and well-mannered. And it's just heartbreaking to me that, knowing what I know and knowing it so thoroughly and deeply, because I've seen the evidence myself. I didn't just listen to it like people are listening to me now. I actually got in and found the documents and read it. And it is so wrong for him to be in jail. He must be freed while he is still alive. I want him to enjoy the sky and to share the home with his brother. His brother, Munir, is mostly blind now. And it's very hard for him to do anything, including dialing the phone these days. He sometimes dials me by accident because I'm high up on the list, when he's trying to call somebody else. I feel bad for him, and Sirhan could help him. They need each other, and he should be home. And I hope this program helps people understand. And the next time he's up for parole, I encourage people, write the parole board. You can Google the parole board's address. You can email them through the website. It's super easy to do. But this man should be freed. He was never guilty and never even wanted to kill Robert Kennedy. Well, you definitely have to read my book, which is called A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. But there's also a website I would encourage you to go to. It's called Mary Ferrell, MaryFerrell.org. And there you can read the trial transcript for yourself. You can read the original witness statements. If you get really curious, you can, order audio tapes of some of the witnesses talking. I mean, it's a fantastic resource, and you will see that everything I said in my book is true, factual, and based on actual documents.